February 6, 2026, Tokyo. Japan's 40-year government bonds spike to 4%, first time in recorded history. Within hours, the American Treasury Secretary is on the phone, not a courtesy call, an emergency. Why would the U.S. care about Japanese bond yields? Because Japan holds $1.2 trillion in U.S. debt. If they're forced to sell, global interest rates explode. But here's what matters. This isn't new. This exact mechanism has destroyed currencies for 2,000 years. Rome did it, Weimar Germany did it, Latin America did it. And now, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom are doing it simultaneously. Not from incompetence, from mathematics. When governments get trapped by debt, they always choose the same exit: debasement. This is the autopsy of that trap, and it's happening right now. The pattern. A sovereign debt trap follows 5 stages every time. Stage 1. Borrow during prosperity. Growth covers the interest. Everything seems fine. Stage 2. Debt accumulates faster than the economy grows. Decades of promises become permanent spending. Stage 3. Interest costs consume tax revenue. You're no longer borrowing for investment. You're borrowing to pay interest on old debt. Stage 4. Old debt matures. You can't pay it back, so you refinance at higher rates. The cost explodes. Stage 5. 2 choices: default or debasement. Default means political collapse, economic disaster, loss of credibility for generations. Debasement means print money, inflate the currency, pay debt in devalued money. Politically survivable, economically destructive, but slow enough that voters don't riot immediately. Every government in history chooses debasement. Now, let me show you the pattern in action. Rome, the original blueprint. 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire is bleeding money, constant wars, massive army, expensive bureaucracy. The solution: debase the currency. The denarius starts at 95% pure silver under Augustus. By AD 200, it's 50% silver. By AD 270, less than 5%. Same coin, same appearance, but the value has been systematically destroyed. Why? Because Rome was trapped, couldn't raise taxes without rebellion, couldn't cut spending without losing the army. So they debased. Inflation exploded. Prices rose 1,000% over 100 years. A soldier's annual wage could barely buy a week's grain by AD 300. Savings evaporated. Anyone holding Roman coins lost everything. The empire survived, the currency didn't. Same trap, same choice, same outcome. Weimar Germany, the modern horror. Germany loses World War I. Treaty of Versailles demands reparations, 132 billion gold marks, more than their entire economy. They can't pay, so they print. In 1919, 30 billion marks in circulation. By 1923, 497 quintillion marks. The exchange rate collapses. 1914, 4.2 marks per dollar. November 1923, 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. Prices double every 3.7 days at the peak. A loaf of bread costs 250 marks in January. By November, 200 billion marks. Savings, pensions, bonds, all annihilated. Why did they do it? They were trapped. Reparations had to be paid. Default would trigger occupation. So they printed, and the currency died. But here's what people miss. This wasn't reckless money printing. This was a debt trap. The reparations created an impossible equation. Debasement was the only exit. The mechanism: why inflation is inevitable. Let me show you the mathematics. Government has 100 units of debt, 10 units of annual revenue. Interest rate at 2% costs 2 units per year. That's 20% of revenue, manageable. Interest rate rises to 6%, costs 6 units per year. That's 60% of revenue. 3 options: raise taxes by 60%, political suicide, economy collapses. Cut spending by 60%, also impossible, that's healthcare, pensions, defense, education gone, riots, government falls. Inflate the debt away. Print money, create 10% inflation, your 100 units of debt becomes 90 in real terms after 1 year. After 10 years, it's worth 35. You didn't default, didn't raise taxes, didn't cut spending, just made money worth less. Politically survivable, economically destructive, but slow enough that voters don't riot immediately. This is why every trapped government chooses inflation. It's not stupidity, it's the only mathematical exit. The present, 3 traps closing. Japan, debt $10.4 trillion, 236% of GDP. For 30 years, they survived through zero interest rates. When you borrow at 0%, even massive debt is manageable. December 2025, Bank of Japan raises rates to 0.75%, highest in 3 decades. Suddenly, debt service costs spike. 31.3 trillion yen in 2025, up 10.8% in 1 year, and accelerating, because Japan is refinancing 30 years of 0% debt at new rates, triple the interest cost on the same debt. January 2026, Prime Minister announces $135 billion stimulus, more borrowing. She promises to suspend consumption tax that eliminates $31.7 billion in revenue. More spending, less revenue, more debt. The bond market panics. 40-year yields hit 4%. 10-year yields hit 2.35%. The trap is closing. Germany, the fiscal disciplinarian of Europe, the country that writes it into their constitution, deficits cannot exceed 0.35% of GDP. January 2026, approved budget shows 4% deficit, 10 times over their constitutional limit. How? Creative accounting, off-budget infrastructure funds, defense exemptions, emergency declarations. Why the sudden break? 2 years of recession. No growth means no tax revenue, but spending remains. Germany is trapped. Can't grow fast enough, so they borrow. Debt projected to rise from 63% of GDP to 80% by 2029. The Bundesbank president warns sustainability of public debt could be jeopardized. Central bank language for "we're approaching the edge." United Kingdom, 30-year gilt yields 5.64%, higher than during the Liz Truss crisis. Remember her? Prime Minister for 49 days? Her budget crashed the bond market at 5.1%. Today's yields are higher, but this time it's structural. UK debt 94 to 100% of GDP. Interest payments $110 billion per year, double the defense budget, just to service debt. The Bank of England is cutting rates, but bond yields are rising anyway. That's the market saying, we don't trust you. When central banks cut, but yields rise, investors demand higher returns because they see the trap forming. 3 countries, 3 simultaneous debt traps, 3 identical exits. Debasement. The refinancing cliff. Global public debt, $100 trillion. That's 93% of GDP. Here's the critical number. 42% of that debt matures by 2027. $42 trillion must be repaid or refinanced in the next 18 months. Most was borrowed between 2008 and 2021 at near zero rates. 10-year bonds at 0.5%, 30-year bonds at 1.5%. Those bonds are maturing now. Governments must refinance. But rates have tripled. That 0.5% bond now refinances at 3 to 4.5%, 6 to 9 times more expensive. Same debt, 9 times the annual interest cost. The nation Thailand published analysis January 2026. This year will show early warning signs before the world slides into a debt trap by decade's end. A debt trap is when you borrow just to pay interest on old debt, never reducing principal, just feeding the monster. That's where we are globally. IMF projects debt will exceed 100% of global GDP by 2030. Last time that happened, 1945, end of World War II. But we're not rebuilding from war. We're just spending more than we earn every year for decades. Why central banks cannot escape? Central banks exist to fight inflation. Textbook response, raise interest rates. But when debt is 100 to 200% of GDP, raising rates becomes impossible.
American example, $38 trillion in debt, 125% of GDP. 2025 interest payments, $881 billion, more than defense, more than Medicare. Average interest rate, 3.5%. If the Fed raises rates to 6% to crush inflation, interest costs rise to $2.3 trillion per year. That's more than total individual income tax revenue. Impossible, unsustainable. So the Fed is trapped, cannot raise rates high enough without bankrupting the government. Same for Japan, same for Germany, same for the UK. They need higher rates to fight inflation, but higher rates make debt unsustainable. So they choose the lesser evil, controlled inflation. 3 to 4% becomes structural, permanent, not because they want it, because the mathematics leave no other option.
And when inflation is structural, cash loses value every single year. What happens to your cash? You have £100,000 in savings. Bank pays 4% interest. Inflation runs at 3%. You pay 25% on interest. The calculation? 4% interest minus 1% tax minus 3% inflation equals 0% real return. Your money stands still. If inflation rises to 4%, you lose 1% per year in purchasing power. Over 10 years at 4% inflation, your £100,000 becomes worth £67,000 in today's money. Not through a crash, through systematic erosion. This happened in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina and Brazil. It's happening now. The historical constant. Since 1971, when Nixon ended the gold standard, the US dollar has lost 86% of purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1971 costs $7.50 today. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, 2007, under $900 billion. 2020, peaked at $9 trillion. Currently, $6.6 trillion. 7 times larger than before 2008. Every time the Fed buys bonds, it creates new money. More money chasing the same goods means higher prices. That's debasement, modern, systematic, and permanent. And the Fed cannot reverse it. Selling those bonds would crash markets and spike rates, making debt unsustainable. They're trapped, so the balance sheet stays elevated. Currency continues to debase. This isn't conspiracy. It's published policy. And it's identical to what Rome did, what Weimar did, what every debt-trapped government has done. The mechanism never changes. Only the speed varies. Conclusion. The autopsy is complete. Rome debased the denarius from 95% silver to 5% over 70 years. Empire survived. Currency did not. Weimar printed the Reichsmark into oblivion in 5 years. Government survived. Savings did not. Latin America inflated away debt in the 1980s. Countries survived. Pensioners did not. Today, Japan, 236% debt to GDP, refinancing 30 years of zero-rate debt at higher costs. Government breaking constitutional deficit limits, borrowing €174 billion despite recession. UK, gilt yields higher than during government collapse. Interest doubled defense budget. Globally, 42% of $100 trillion refinancing by 2027 at rates triple the original cost. Central banks cannot raise rates high enough to fight inflation without bankrupting governments. So inflation persists, 3 to 4%. Structural, permanent. Cash loses value, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. This is not prediction, it's pattern, repeated across 2,000 years. The question isn't if it happens, it's what you do with this knowledge. In Rome, survivors moved to land and commodities. In Weimar, those who survived held foreign assets and tangibles. In Latin America, wealth preservation meant dollars, property, businesses with pricing power. The lesson is constant. When currencies debase, move to things that cannot be printed.
Not speculation, preservation. The debt trap is closing. Those who studied the autopsy know what comes next.